The woman had no idea she was being filmed. What she did for a dying horse left people in tears. The snow fell in silent, unforgiving sheets, blanketing the world in white as Clara Thompson pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her thin frame. Her breath formed small clouds that disappeared into the darkening sky. 3 days without a proper meal had left her lightheaded, her steps unsteady as she trudged along the deserted country road. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, though she had no destination in mind. At 34, Clara had mastered the art of lying to herself. It was the only comfort she could afford. Once she had been someone. Clara Thompson, top of her class at the prestigious Westfield Veterinary School, specializing in equine medicine. Clara Thompson, whose professors spoke of her natural talent with animals in tones of reverence. Clara Thompson, who volunteered every weekend at the animal shelter and spent her summers working at therapeutic riding camps for disabled children. That woman existed only in memory now, as faded as the ID card she still carried in her backpack, a talisman from a different life. The accident happened during her final year of study. A midnight call from the hospital. Her parents and younger brother, a head-on collision with a drunk driver. By the time she arrived, tear-stained and breathless, they were gone. All 3 of them, in an instant. Clara paused on the roadside, leaning against a weathered fence post as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The memory still had the power to knock the wind from her lungs, even 5 years later. The medical bills came first. Her brother had survived for 6 hours on life support before following their parents. Then the funeral expenses. The mortgage on her parents' house, which she discovered was underwater. Student loans that couldn't be deferred any longer. The grief counselors she couldn't afford but desperately needed. One by one, the pillars of her life crumbled. She took a leave of absence from school, intending to return after settling her family's affairs. But there was always another bill, another crisis, another night spent staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping. When she finally tried to return to her studies, her mind refused to focus. The once promising student couldn't remember basic anatomy, couldn't steady her hands during labs. "Take more time," her academic advisor suggested gently. "Your place will be waiting." But time hadn't healed Clara. It had only taught her how quickly a life could unravel. She sold the house at a loss, lived in her car until it was repossessed, couch-surfed with increasingly reluctant friends until she ran out of couches. The veterinary program held her spot for 2 years before reluctantly giving it to someone else. Now, as the temperature dropped and darkness gathered, Clara had only one goal: survive another night. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally. Clara squinted, barely making out a large sign partially covered in snow. With numb fingers, she brushed away the white powder. Silvercrest Ranch, private property, no trespassing. Beyond the sign, she could just make out the silhouette of buildings in the distance. The main house, dark and imposing on a hill, and scattered outbuildings, barns, perhaps, or storage sheds. Most importantly, she noticed a gap in the fence where the wood had rotted away, just wide enough for a person to slip through. Clara hesitated, her conscience battling with her desperation. Breaking and entering wasn't something she did, wasn't something the old Clara would ever consider. But the old Clara hadn't known what it was like to feel her body temperature dropping dangerously low, hadn't experienced the particular despair of having nowhere to go as night fell. A violent shiver decided for her. She squeezed through the gap, wincing as a jagged piece of wood snagged her coat, tearing it further. The property was expansive, the kind of ranch that spoke of old money and generations of careful stewardship. In the summer, it would likely be breathtaking. Tonight, it was a monochrome landscape of shadows and snow, beautiful in its desolation. Clara stayed close to the tree line, making her way toward what appeared to be the oldest, most distant barn, furthest from the main house and therefore safest. As she drew closer, she noticed the barn's weathered appearance. Unlike the other structures, which were clearly well maintained, this one had an air of neglect. Paint peeled from its sides, and one of the large double doors hung slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind with a plaintive creak. Perfect. An abandoned barn meant shelter without the risk of discovery. Clara approached cautiously, alert for any signs of security cameras or alarm systems. But the only sound was the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. The door groaned in protest as she pushed it open just wide enough to slip inside. The interior was pitch black and smelled of dust, old hay, and something else, something organic and vaguely medicinal. Clara fumbled in her backpack for her most precious possession, a small flashlight with batteries she rationed carefully, using them only in dire emergencies. This qualified. She clicked it on, keeping the beam pointed downward to minimize the chance of the light being spotted from outside. The barn was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with a high ceiling lost in shadows. Old horse stalls lined both sides of a central aisle, most empty save for ancient tack hanging on rusty hooks. Scattered hay bales, farm equipment retired decades ago, and the occasional mouse scurrying for cover completed the picture of abandonment. "Hello?" Clara whispered, not expecting an answer but needing to confirm her solitude. Only silence responded, broken by the occasional creak of timber as the wind buffeted the structure. Relieved, she made her way deeper into the barn, looking for the most sheltered spot to spend the night. Something caught her eye in the last stall, a darker shadow against the general darkness. She swung her flashlight toward it, and her breath caught in her throat. A horse. Emaciated, filthy, its once glossy coat dull and matted. It lay on its side in dirty straw, its breathing shallow and labored. Even from a distance, Clara could see its ribs protruding sharply against its skin, could count each vertebra in its spine. "Oh my God!" she whispered, all thoughts of her own discomfort forgotten as she rushed to the stall. The door hung open, its latch broken. Inside, the smell of illness and neglect was overwhelming. The horse, a stallion, she realized, barely reacted to her presence, managing only to roll one dull eye in her direction before closing it again, as if the effort was too much. Clara knelt beside him, her trained eye quickly assessing his condition. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, possible pneumonia from the sound of his breathing. A pressure sore had formed where his hip bone pressed against the ground. His water bucket was empty save for a layer of ice at the bottom. His feed trough held only moldy hay. "What happened to you?" she murmured, running her hand gently along his neck, feeling the irregular, weak pulse beneath his skin. "Where is everyone?" A small, tarnished nameplate on the stall caught her eye. "Solace. Solace," she repeated softly. "That's your name, boy? Doesn't seem like you've had much of that lately." The stallion's ear twitched almost imperceptibly at the sound of his name, the only indication he was still aware of his surroundings. Clara sat back on her heels, conflict raging within her. She needed rest, needed to conserve her own strength, to survive. This wasn't her horse, wasn't her problem. For all she knew, Solace was beyond saving, deliberately left here to die naturally rather than being euthanized. She had nothing to offer, no food, no medicine, barely enough energy to keep herself alive. And yet, her hand moved of its own accord, stroking the stallion's dull coat. Once, this animal had been magnificent, she could tell from his bone structure, from the fine shape of his head. Someone had valued him, once. Someone had given him a name that promised comfort. "I can't just leave you like this," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't." It had been years since Clara had allowed herself to feel anything deeply. Survival required a certain emotional detachment, a narrowing of focus to the immediate needs of the moment. Caring hurt too much. Caring required resources she didn't have. But as she looked at Solace, something long dormant stirred within her. The woman who had once dreamed of healing animals, of easing their suffering and earning their trust, that woman wasn't entirely gone after all. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the barn's timbers. The temperature would drop further tonight, perhaps fatally low for a creature as weakened as Solace. For herself as well, if she was honest. Clara shrugged off her backpack and unzipped it, taking inventory of her meager possessions. Half a sandwich saved from a dumpster dive behind a cafe, wrapped carefully in its original paper. A plastic bottle with a few inches of water. A threadbare blanket. A small first aid kit with basics like aspirin and bandages. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But as she looked at Solace, his sides heaving with each labored breath, Clara made a decision. She would try. Even if it was futile, even if it cost her the sandwich she'd been saving, even if it meant exposing herself to discovery when morning came. Some things were worth the risk. What Clara couldn't know, was that in the darkened study of the main house, a security monitor flickered to life as motion sensors detected her presence in the old barn. And what she couldn't see was the weathered face of the man watching her, his expression shifting from suspicion to disbelief to something like wonder, as he witnessed a homeless woman kneeling beside a dying horse, offering comfort she couldn't afford to give. Clara's veterinary training kicked in despite the years of disuse. She placed her palm against Solace's neck, counting the irregular beats of his pulse. Too slow, too weak. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one seeming like it might be his last. Hypothermia, dehydration, starvation, she murmured, mentally cataloging his symptoms. Probably pneumonia too, from the sound of those lungs. In a proper veterinary hospital, the treatment would be clear: for fluids, broad-spectrum antibiotics, warming blankets, careful nutritional support. But here, in an abandoned barn with nothing but the contents of her backpack, Clara would have to improvise. First, water. She examined Solace's empty bucket, crusted with ice at the bottom. Taking it, she pushed open the barn door and filled it with fresh snow, then returned to the stall and placed it near the stallion's head. "The snow will melt from our body heat," she explained to Solace, as if he could understand. Speaking aloud helped Clara focus, kept the creeping despair at bay. "Not ideal, but it's clean at least." Next, she carefully unwrapped her precious half-sandwich. The bread was slightly stale, but the peanut butter inside would provide desperately needed calories. Breaking off a small piece, she moistened it with a few drops from her water bottle and held it to Solace's lips. "Come on, boy," she coaxed. "Just a little." Solace didn't respond, his eyes remaining closed. Clara frowned, concern deepening the lines on her weather-beaten face. If he wouldn't eat voluntarily, she'd have to try something else. Gently, she pried open his mouth and placed the moistened bread on his tongue, then stroked his throat to encourage swallowing. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, his throat muscles contracted. "Good boy," Clara whispered, relief washing over her. "That's it." She continued this painstaking process, feeding him tiny amounts every few minutes, interspersing it with droplets of water. It was slow, exhausting work, but each successful swallow felt like a victory. She saved 1/4 of the sandwich for herself, eating it in small bites as she worked, knowing she needed to maintain her own strength. The wind outside increased, howling through the cracks in the barn's wooden walls. Clara shivered violently, her thin coat offering little protection against the biting cold. Without hesitation, she unfolded her blanket, her only real defense against hypothermia, and spread it over Solace's trembling form. "You need this more than I do," she told him, though her body screamed in protest. Searching around the barn, Clara gathered handfuls of old straw, piling it around and over the horse for added insulation. She found a tattered horse blanket hanging on a hook and added that too, tucking the edges around Solace's thin body. The physical exertion helped warm her, temporarily keeping the worst of the cold at bay. As she worked, memories surfaced from her veterinary training. Professor Harrington's voice, clear as day. "In cases of severe hypothermia, shared body heat may be the only available option." Clara hesitated only briefly before stretching out alongside Solace, pressing her body against his side. She could feel his ribs against her, sharp and prominent, and the stuttering rise and fall of his breathing. The stallion's body was cooler than it should be, another dangerous sign. "When I was in vet school," Clara said softly, continuing to talk more for her own benefit than his, "they taught us that horses are social animals. They're not meant to be alone. Did you have friends once, Solace? Other horses to run with?" The stallion's ear twitched slightly, the only acknowledgement of her voice. "I had friends too. Before." She sighed, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Funny how quickly they disappear when you've got nothing left to offer." Clara ran her hand along Solace's neck in long, gentle strokes, the way she'd been taught to soothe frightened horses. The repetitive motion was calming for her too, anchoring her in the present moment rather than the painful past or uncertain future. "You know, I specialized in equine medicine," she continued. "Horses were always my favorite. There's something about them, their strength, their gentleness. The way they can read people." She swallowed hard, fighting back unexpected tears. "I was 6 months away from my degree when everything fell apart." Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world beyond the barn. Inside, the only sounds were Solace's labored breathing and Clara's quiet voice as she shared stories from her past. Tales of successful treatments during her clinical rotations, funny anecdotes about stubborn ponies she'd worked with, the dream practice she'd planned to open someday. Time blurred as exhaustion crept over her. Still, Clara continued her ministrations, breaking the snow in the bucket as it melted, offering tiny amounts of water and food, checking Solace's pulse and respiration rate, and monitoring his body temperature against her own. "Don't die," she murmured, her voice cracking. "Please don't die tonight." Around midnight, Clara noticed something alarming. Solace had stopped shivering. In humans, that would be a dangerous sign, indicating the body no longer had the energy to generate heat. She pressed closer to him, willing her own warmth to transfer to his failing body. Desperate for anything that might help, Clara began to sing. Her voice, unused to anything but necessary speech, came out rough and quiet at first. A lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child, then folk songs, then anything she could remember. The sound filled the empty barn, a defiant warmth against the cold darkness. To her surprise, Solace's breathing seemed to steady somewhat as she sang. His ear flicked toward her more consistently, and once, just once, his eye opened fully, fixing on her face for a brief moment before closing again. Clara clung to that small sign of awareness. "That's it," she encouraged. "Stay with me, Solace. Just until morning. We'll get help then." She had no idea if help would come, or if morning would bring discovery and her forcible removal from the property. But right now, that didn't matter. All that mattered was keeping this magnificent creature alive through the night. As the hours wore on, Clara began to notice subtle changes. Solace's pulse, while still weaker than it should be, had become slightly more regular. His breathing, though labored, seemed less desperate. When she offered water, his lips moved almost voluntarily toward her cupped hands. "You're fighting," she whispered. "Good boy. Keep fighting." Outside, the storm began to ease. Through a crack in the barn wall, Clara could see the sky clearing, stars appearing between fast-moving clouds. The temperature would drop further without the insulating cloud cover, but at least the brutal wind had died down. Clara huddled closer to Solace, sharing every bit of warmth she could spare. She was beyond exhausted now, her limbs leaden, her mind foggy. Yet she continued talking to him, stroking his neck, offering water, checking his vital signs. She had become his lifeline, and she would not let go, not while there was breath in her body. "We'll make it till dawn," she promised him, her voice barely audible now. Together. What Clara couldn't know was that dawn would bring far more than just survival. It would bring a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. But for now, in the quiet darkness of the abandoned barn, there was only a dying horse and a homeless woman, two forgotten souls finding unexpected solace in each other's company. Miles Callahan sat in his darkened study, a tumbler of whiskey clutched in his weathered hand. The amber liquid caught the glow from the security monitors, the only light in the room. At 62, Miles had grown accustomed to silence and solitude, had even convinced himself he preferred it this way. The security system had been his late wife's idea. Just a precaution, Eleanor had insisted 3 years ago, concerned about reports of equipment theft from neighboring ranches. Miles had agreed only to appease her, never imagining he'd one day find himself obsessively watching the screens, seeking some connection to the outside world without having to actually engage with it. Miles took another sip of whiskey, letting it burn down his throat. He was about to shut down the system and drag himself upstairs to bed when movement on monitor 4 caught his eye. Someone was in the old barn, the one he hadn't entered since Eleanor's death. His first instinct was to call the sheriff. His hand actually reached for the phone before something made him pause. The figure on the screen wasn't stealing equipment or vandalizing property. Instead, the trespasser, a woman, he realized, as the camera angle shifted, was kneeling beside Solace. "What the hell?" Miles muttered, leaning closer to the screen. Solace. Eleanor's prized Arabian stallion. Once the jewel of their breeding program, worth more than most people's homes. Miles had left the horse to die. He admitted that to himself now, the whiskey loosening the tight control he normally kept on uncomfortable truths. After Eleanor's cancer diagnosis, Miles had thrown himself into caring for her, letting the ranch operations slide. During her final months, the staff had dwindled to just the essential workers who maintained the profitable sections of Silvercrest. The old barn, housing only solace and painful memories, had been all but abandoned. When the vet had come out last month, his assessment had been blunt. The horse has pneumonia, severe malnutrition, and likely a host of other issues. Treatment would be extensive, expensive, and might not work. Given his age and condition, humane euthanasia might be the kindest option. Miles hadn't been able to do it. Couldn't bring himself to end the life of Eleanor's beloved horse, the animal she'd spent countless hours training, grooming, talking to during her illness. But neither could he bear to resume care of the stallion himself. So he'd done nothing, a decision of absence rather than action. He'd instructed the remaining ranch hands to leave the old barn alone, making excuses about structural issues, and tried to forget about the dying horse inside. Now, watching the security footage, Miles saw a stranger doing what he couldn't. The woman was thin, clearly homeless from the look of her ragged clothes, yet she moved with purpose. Miles' eyes widened as she shared her meager food with Solace, as she collected snow for water, as she removed her own blanket to cover the shivering horse. "Who are you?" he whispered to the screen. He increased the volume, surprised to hear her talking to Solace, her voice surprisingly educated despite her appearance. As she mentioned veterinary school, pieces began falling into place. Not just a random act of kindness, then. This woman knew what she was doing. For hours, Miles sat transfixed, unable to tear his eyes away from the monitor. He watched as the woman sang to Solace, her voice growing hoarser as the night progressed but never stopping. He saw her curl her body against the horse's side, sharing what little warmth she had. He witnessed her checking the animal's pulse, his respiration, with professional regularity. The whiskey sat forgotten as dawn approached. For the first time in years, Miles felt something crack in his chest, a fissure in the shell of numbness he'd built around himself. 3 days ago, he had received a letter from Westridge Development Corporation, offering to buy Silvercrest Ranch for a sum that had made his eyebrows raise. "Prime location for our new resort community," the letter had stated. Miles had been considering it seriously. What was the point of maintaining the ranch without Eleanor? Their daughter, Caroline, had her own life in Chicago, visiting only at Christmas and calling with decreasing frequency. The ranch was just land and buildings now, not a home. But watching the homeless woman fighting to save a horse she had no connection to, no responsibility for, stirred something long dormant in Miles. Something that felt uncomfortably like shame. He thought back to the vet's actual words that day. He needs round-the-clock care for at least a week. Antibiotics, proper nutrition, someone to stay with him. If you're not prepared to commit to that, Mr. Callahan, then the kindest thing would be to put him down. Miles had heard what he wanted to hear, that the horse was beyond saving. But watching the woman on the screen, seeing Solace's ear twitch toward her voice, noting the almost imperceptible improvement in the horse's breathing pattern over the course of the night, he realized he'd been wrong. He hadn't been protecting Solace from suffering. He'd been protecting himself from effort, from possible failure, from caring about something that might be lost. Just like he'd been doing with the entire ranch since Eleanor died. The desk phone rang, startling Miles from his thoughts. He answered mechanically. "Mr. Callahan?" It's Dave from Security Monitoring. We've got an alert from the old barn. Someone broke in during the night. Want us to send a team out there? Miles cleared his throat. No, Dave. False alarm. I was checking on some old equipment there last night. Forgot to reset the system. You sure, sir? The motion detection has been active for several hours. I'm sure, Miles said firmly. Thanks for the call. He hung up, his decision made. Not a decision to call the sheriff, not a decision to sell the ranch and wash his hands of it all. But a decision to act, to step out of the comfortable numbness he'd wrapped around himself like a burial shroud. The eastern sky was lightening to a pale gray as Miles pulled on his boots and heavy coat. In the mudroom, he hesitated before opening a cabinet that had remained closed for 2 years. Inside were Eleanor's things, her favorite jacket, her riding gloves, her medical kit. The sight of them still hurt, but for the first time, the pain felt clean somehow, necessary. Miles took the medical kit and a thermos, which he filled with hot coffee from the pot he'd made hours earlier. He added a blanket from the linen closet, fresh and warm, and some leftover dinner rolls from the kitchen. Not much, but it would have to do until he could get proper supplies. As he stepped out into the cold morning air, Miles felt oddly light, as if some great weight had shifted slightly on his shoulders. The path to the old barn was overgrown, untended since Eleanor's death. His boots crunched through frozen undergrowth and newly fallen snow, leaving clear tracks behind him, the first sign in years that someone from the main house had visited this part of the property. The barn door was partially open, just as he'd seen on the security feed. Miles paused outside, suddenly uncertain. What would he say to this woman? How could he explain his neglect of Solace? What right did he have to intrude on the scene he'd been watching all night? This moment of genuine compassion that stood in stark contrast to his own failures. But behind his hesitation lay a deeper fear, that he might find both the horse and the woman gone. Solace succumbed to his illness despite the woman's care, and she disappeared back into the winter landscape, taking with her this unexpected chance at redemption. Taking a deep breath, Miles pushed open the barn door. Clara's throat was raw from hours of singing and talking, but she didn't stop. The sound of her voice seemed to steady Solace, giving him something to focus on beyond his pain. Her fingers had long since gone numb from the cold, yet she continued stroking his neck, monitoring his pulse, offering droplets of water from her cupped hands. "The sun will be up soon," she whispered, glancing at the thin strip of gray light visible through a crack in the barn wall. "Just a little longer." Dawn would bring its own challenges. Clara had no illusions about her situation. She was trespassing on private property, and daylight would almost certainly bring discovery. But maybe, just maybe, whoever owned this ranch would help Solace, even if they called the sheriff on her. A violent shiver racked her body. The temperature had plummeted in the pre-dawn hours, and without her blanket, Clara was dangerously cold. She pressed closer to Solace, their shared warmth the only defense against hypothermia for either of them. "You know what's funny?" she said, her words slightly slurred from exhaustion and cold. "I came in here looking for shelter, and ended up being your shelter instead." She laughed softly. "Life has a strange way of turning things around, doesn't it?" Solace's ear flicked toward her voice, more responsive than it had been hours earlier. Clara took it as a good sign, though she was realistic about his chances. Without proper veterinary care, antibiotics for fluids, professional monitoring, his survival remained uncertain. "I had a horse when I was a girl," Clara continued, filling the silence with memories. "Not my own, we could never afford that. But I worked at the local stables after school, mucking out stalls in exchange for riding lessons." Her eyes grew distant, seeing not the dilapidated barn but sun-drenched fields from her childhood. "There was this one mare, Buttercup. Ornery old thing, wouldn't let anyone ride her but me. The owner said she was too unpredictable, but I knew better." Clara shifted slightly, adjusting the horse blanket over Solace's thin frame. "She wasn't unpredictable at all. She just needed someone to listen to her, to pay attention to what she was trying to say. That's when I knew I wanted to be a vet. Not just to fix animals when they're broken, but to be their voice when no one else is listening. Solace made a soft sound, almost a sigh, and for a terrifying moment, Clara thought it might be his last breath. But then his chest rose again, his breathing slightly stronger than before. "That's it," she encouraged. "Keep fighting." As Clara talked, her mind drifted to what would happen after today. If she was lucky, she'd avoid arrest for trespassing. If she was very lucky, she might even get a hot meal and a few hours in a shelter before returning to the streets. The thought brought no particular emotion, just a dull acceptance of her reality. What she didn't consider, couldn't imagine, was that her life might change entirely. That this night, this horse, might be the pivot point she'd stopped hoping for years ago. "You know what I miss most?" she asked Solace, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Not the comfortable bed or regular meals, though those would be nice. I miss having a purpose. A reason to get up in the morning beyond just surviving another day." She checked his pulse again, her fingers pressing gently against his neck. "Like tonight. Helping you, it matters. It's the first thing I've done in years that truly matters." As if in response, Solace's eye opened fully, clearer than it had been all night. He gazed at Clara with surprising lucidity, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "You understand, don't you?" Clara murmured, tears welling unexpectedly. "What it's like to be forgotten. To be left behind." The emotion caught her off guard. Clara had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. They solved nothing, helped no one. Yet now they flowed freely, years of suppressed grief finding release in this quiet moment with a dying horse who somehow understood her pain. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her face with a grimy sleeve. "Getting sentimental won't help either of us." Returning to practical matters, Clara checked the melted snow in the bucket. There was enough for a few more handfuls of water. She scooped some into her palms and brought it to Solace's mouth, encouraged when his lips moved more decisively toward the moisture. "Good boy," she praised. "Every little bit helps." Outside, birds began their morning songs, their cheerful notes at odds with the gravity inside the barn. Clara's body screamed for rest, for warmth, for food. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision, warning signs of exhaustion and hypothermia that she recognized from her medical training but could do nothing about. "Just need to stay awake," she muttered, pinching her arm hard. "Just until someone comes." To keep herself conscious, Clara began reciting everything she could remember about equine pneumonia from her veterinary courses. Treatment protocol includes broad-spectrum antibiotics, preferably penicillin or ceftiofur. Supportive care is essential, proper hydration, nutrition, and maintaining body temperature. Her voice took on a lecturer's cadence, steady and authoritative despite her deteriorating condition. Recovery depends on early intervention, the animal's age and previous health status, and environmental factors. The clinical recitation helped focus her mind, pushing back the fog of exhaustion. More importantly, it gave Solace something to anchor to, a human voice, confident and calm. In cases of severe malnutrition, refeeding must be approached with caution, she continued. Small, frequent meals are preferable to avoid refeeding syndrome, which can cause dangerous electrolyte imbalances and... Clara's monologue was interrupted by a sound that sent ice through her veins, the creak of the barn door opening. Daylight flooded the dim interior as a tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. Time seemed to suspend as Clara's exhausted mind processed what was happening. Discovery. Confrontation. Possibly arrest. Her instinct was to run, but she couldn't leave Solace, not when he'd made it through the night, not when he was finally showing signs of improvement. So instead, Clara did the only thing she could. She placed herself between the approaching figure and the horse, a final protective gesture even as her vision tunneled and her legs threatened to give way. "He needs help," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "Please, whatever you do to me, help him." The figure moved closer, and Clara braced herself for anger, for accusations. But what happened next defied every expectation, every pattern she'd come to know in her years on the streets. The man, older, weathered, with grief etched deeply in the lines of his face, knelt beside her. And instead of harsh words or threats, He simply held out a thermos. "It's coffee," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You look like you could use it." Clara stared at him, uncomprehending, as shock and exhaustion finally claimed her. The last thing she saw before darkness engulfed her was Solace's eye, bright and alert, watching her as she collapsed into the straw beside him. And the last thing she heard was the man's voice, unexpectedly gentle. "You saved him. Now let me help you both." Clara awoke to unfamiliar sensations, warmth, softness, the absence of pain. For a moment, she thought she might be dead. Then the smell of antiseptic and the distant whicker of horses brought her back to reality, a reality she couldn't immediately comprehend. She was in a bed. A real bed with clean sheets and a down comforter. Sunlight streamed through half-drawn curtains, illuminating a spacious bedroom decorated in muted blues and grays. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace across the room. On a bedside table sat a glass of water, a bowl of what looked like soup, and several prescription bottles. Clara's mind struggled to connect this luxurious setting with her last memories: the freezing barn, the dying horse, the tall figure in the doorway. "Solace," she gasped, attempting to sit up. The room spun violently, forcing her back against the pillows. "He's alive!" came a deep voice from the corner of the room. Clara turned her head carefully to see the man from the barn, older than she'd initially thought, with silver hair and a face weathered by sun and sorrow. He sat in an armchair, watching her with an unreadable expression. "The vet's been out twice," he continued. "Says it's touch and go, but he's got a fighting chance thanks to you." He paused, studying her face. "I'm Miles Callahan. This is my ranch." Clara swallowed, her throat painfully dry. "I'm sorry for trespassing," she managed. "I just needed somewhere to shelter from the storm," Miles finished for her. "And instead, you spent the night saving my horse." Clara reached for the water glass, her hand trembling with weakness. Miles moved quickly for a man his age, stepping forward to help her drink. The simple act of assistance from a stranger was so unexpected that Clara felt tears threatening again. "How long have I been out?" she asked, desperate to change the subject before emotion overwhelmed her. "Almost 24 hours. Doc Jenkins, he's the local physician, stopped by after examining Solace. Said you had moderate hypothermia, exhaustion, and the early stages of pneumonia yourself." Miles's mouth tightened. "Ironic that you both had the same condition." Clara nodded, pieces falling into place. "You're giving me antibiotics," she said, glancing at the prescription bottles. "And you're going to take them all, exactly as prescribed," Miles said firmly. "Doctor's orders." A silence fell between them, laden with unasked questions. Clara broke it first. "Why was Solace in that condition?" she asked, unable to keep a hint of accusation from her voice despite her vulnerable position. Miles flinched as if she'd struck him. He walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered ranch grounds. "Solace was my wife's horse," he said finally. "Eleanor bought him as a colt, trained him herself. When she got sick, cancer, that horse was the only thing that could make her smile near the end." His voice caught. "After she died 2 years ago, I couldn't bear to look at him. Couldn't bear to sell him either. So you left him in that barn," Clara finished, her tone softer now. Miles nodded, still facing the window. "The ranch hands were told to feed him, check on him. But they have their own duties, their own lives. Over time, visits became less frequent. When he got sick last month, the vet said he needed round-the-clock care or—" He swallowed hard. "I told myself he was too far gone, that nature should take its course." He turned to face her, his eyes red-rimmed. "And then you came along. A complete stranger with nothing, less than nothing, and you did what I couldn't. You faced what I was too cowardly to face." Clara didn't know how to respond. In another life, she might have condemned this man for his neglect. But years on the street had taught her that human grief and failure were complicated things. "I've been watching the security footage," Miles continued. "From the barn. Watching you sing to him, talk to him. Share your food with him when you clearly needed it yourself. He approached the bed, his expression intense. You're a vet? Or we're studying to be one? Almost finished my degree, Clara said. 5 years ago. Miles nodded as if confirming something to himself. I made some calls while you were sleeping. To Westfield Veterinary School. Clara stiffened. You had no right. They remember you. Miles continued, ignoring her protest. Dr. Harrington specifically said you were one of the most promising students they'd ever had. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Also said your spot is still open if you want it. Apparently, they never completely closed your file. Clara stared at him, speechless. The casual way he'd upended her world with a few phone calls was staggering. Why would you do that? She finally asked. Miles sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. Because I need to make things right. Not just with Solace, but with this whole ranch. With Eleanor's memory. He met Clara's gaze directly. And you need a second chance. I can't afford. I'm offering you a job. Miles interrupted. Ranch veterinarian. Room and board included, plus salary. Enough to finish your degree, if that's what you want. Clara shook her head, overwhelmed. You don't know me. I could be anyone. I know exactly who you are. Miles countered. I watched you all night. Watched you give everything you had, which wasn't much, to save a horse you had no connection to, no responsibility for. His voice grew rough with emotion. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. A knock at the door prevented Clara from responding. A middle-aged man in jeans and a flannel shirt poked his head in. Sorry to interrupt, boss, but the vet's here again for Solace. Says there's been a change. Fear clutched at Clara's heart. Had all her efforts been for nothing? Help me up, she demanded, already pushing back the covers despite her weakness. Miles looked like he might object, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he offered his arm, supporting her as she shakily got to her feet. Someone had dressed her in clean pajamas several sizes too large, Eleanor's, she guessed, which explained the faint scent of lavender. Together, they made their slow way through the sprawling ranch house and out to a golf cart waiting by the back door. The ranch hand drove them to the old barn, which looked substantially different in daylight. The door had been repaired, fresh straw scattered along the entryway. Inside, a woman in a veterinary jacket was checking Solace's vital signs. The horse himself was now lying on clean bedding, covered with proper equine blankets. An 4-drip had been set up, and monitoring equipment beeped steadily. Ah, you must be our mysterious horse whisperer, the vet said, turning as they entered. I'm Dr. Reynolds. And you've done something quite remarkable here. Is he going to be okay? Clara asked, leaning heavily on Miles's arm. Dr. Reynolds smiled. His labs are improving significantly. Temperatures down, white counts responding to the antibiotics. She gestured to the monitoring equipment. Heart rate's stronger, oxygen saturation's up. And most importantly, she stepped aside, revealing Solace's head. The horse's eyes were open, clear, alert, and fixed directly on Clara. As if he recognized her. As if he'd been waiting for her. He wouldn't take any food from us, Dr. Reynolds said softly. Not until we brought in the blanket you used. The one with your scent on it. Clara moved forward on unsteady legs, Miles still supporting her. When she reached Solace, she sank to her knees beside him, one trembling hand reaching out to stroke his neck. Hey boy, she whispered. You made it. Solace made a soft nickering sound, pressing his muzzle against her palm. Something passed between them in that moment, recognition, connection, a shared triumph over the darkness that had nearly claimed them both. Clara looked up to find Miles watching them, tears streaming unchecked down his weathered face. I've been so blind, he said, his voice breaking. So lost in my own grief that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. In that moment, surrounded by strangers who had somehow become allies, Clara felt something she'd forgotten existed: hope. Not the desperate hope of finding shelter for a night or food for a day, but real hope. Hope for a future. Hope for healing, not just for Solace, but for herself. And perhaps for the broken man who stood watching them with tears in his eyes. "Your offer," she said quietly, her hand still resting on Solace's neck. "Is it still open?" Miles nodded, unable to speak. "Then I accept," Clara said, the words feeling momentous, life-changing. "For his sake. And maybe for ours too." What none of them realized, as they stood in that transformed barn with its atmosphere of tentative hope, was that this moment of connection was being captured by the very same security camera that had recorded Clara's night-long vigil. A recording that would soon change not only their lives, but the lives of countless others who would be moved by the unlikely story of a homeless woman, a dying horse, and the unexpected redemption they found together. 3 weeks passed. Winter's grip on Silvercrest Ranch began to loosen as February gave way to March. Patches of grass emerged from beneath melting snow, and the first tentative birdsong heralded the approaching spring. Inside the ranch's main barn, Solace had been moved from the old structure to a spacious, warm stall in the primary facility. Clara Thompson checked the Arabian's vital signs with practiced hands. His recovery had been remarkable, though not without setbacks. The pneumonia had cleared, his weight was steadily increasing, and the dull coat that had been matted and lifeless now showed hints of its former gleam. "Looking good, handsome," Clara murmured, offering him an apple slice from her palm. Solace's lips tickled her skin as he delicately accepted the treat. "Dr. Reynolds says we can start light exercise next week if your blood work comes back clear." Clara had settled into a routine at Silvercrest with surprising ease. Her own health had improved dramatically with proper nutrition, medication, and rest. Miles had given her a small cottage on the property, once used for guests, and stocked it with everything she might need. They ate dinner together most evenings in the main house, their initial awkwardness gradually giving way to comfortable conversation and even occasional laughter. Clara's days were filled with caring for Solace, assisting with the ranch's other horses, and preparing for her return to veterinary school in the fall. Miles had been true to his word, making arrangements with Westfield to reinstate her scholarship with additional funding from a ranch endowment he'd established in Eleanor's name. It was more than Clara had dared to hope for, a purpose, a home, a future that extended beyond mere survival. Sometimes she woke in the night, certain it was all a dream, that she would open her eyes to find herself huddled beneath a highway overpass or in the doorway of a closed business. But each morning, she awoke to birdsong and the distant nickering of horses, to coffee brewing and fresh clothes laid out for the day ahead. What Clara didn't know, what neither she nor Miles knew, was that their story had traveled far beyond the boundaries of Silvercrest Ranch. Javier Ramirez, one of the ranch hands who'd been helping with Solace's care, had been deeply moved by Clara's story and Miles's transformation. After obtaining permission from the security company to access the footage, he'd edited together a 10-minute video: Clara's arrival in the barn, her desperate efforts to save Solace through the night, her collapse upon Miles's arrival, and finally, the moment when Solace recognized her in the barn 3 days later. He'd added simple captions explaining the context and uploaded it to his barely used social media account with the title, "The woman had no idea she was being filmed. What she did for a dying horse left people in tears." He'd expected perhaps a few dozen views from friends and family. He'd been wrong. Within 24 hours, the video had been shared over 50,000 times. By the end of the week, it had reached 10 million views and been picked up by major news outlets. Something about the story, the homeless woman sacrificing her own comfort for a dying animal, the widower finding redemption through an act of kindness, the horse fighting against the odds, resonated deeply with people across the world. On a Wednesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Clara had stumbled upon Silvercrest Ranch, Miles knocked on her cottage door, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "There's something you need to see," he said, holding up his tablet. Clara followed him to the main house, confusion mounting as she noticed unusual activity around the property. Ranch hands gathered in small groups, talking excitedly, a delivery truck she didn't recognize unloading packages at the main office. In Miles's study, He gestured for her to sit, then handed her the tablet. On the screen was a video of her, in the barn, singing to Solace as she stroked his neck, sharing her meager food with him, wrapping her body around his for warmth. "What is this?" she whispered, watching herself collapse into Miles's arms as the barn door opened. "How?" "Security cameras," Miles said gently. "I watched you all night, remember?" Javier asked if he could share the footage. I said yes, thinking it might touch a few hearts. I had no idea. He gestured to the view counter on the screen. 24,782,615. Clara stared in disbelief. 24 million people have seen this? Miles nodded. And they've been calling, writing, donating. The ranch office has been overwhelmed. He handed her a sheet of paper. This is a partial list of what's come in so far. Clara scanned the list, her hands beginning to tremble. Offers of full veterinary scholarships from 3 different universities. Donations totaling over $350,000 for Clara's Second Chance Fund. Job offers from equine hospitals across the country. A book deal proposal from a major publisher. Donations of equine medical supplies, blankets, feed, and equipment. Offers from 5 different animal welfare organizations to partner with Silvercrest. I don't understand, Clara said, looking up at Miles. Why would people do this? For me? For us? Miles sat beside her, his weathered face solemn. Because genuine kindness has become rare enough to be remarkable. What you did that night, it wasn't for recognition or reward. You did it simply because it needed doing, because you couldn't walk away from suffering even when you had every reason to think only of yourself. He smiled slightly. People respond to that. It reminds them of what's possible. A knock at the study door interrupted them. Javier stood there, looking apologetic. Sorry, Mr. Callahan, but there's a news crew at the gate. Another one. And Dr. Reynolds just called. She says Solace's latest blood work looks great. Miles looked at Clara questioningly. Until now, they'd declined all media requests, preferring to focus on recovery, Solace's, Clara's, and in many ways, Miles's own. Clara took a deep breath. Let them in, she decided. If sharing our story helps others, then it's worth the discomfort. An hour later, Clara stood beside Solace in the sunlit paddock, his gleaming coat a testament to his remarkable recovery. Miles stood on his other side, one hand resting gently on the horse's neck. Behind the news cameras, a small crowd had gathered, ranch hands, local supporters, and 3 formerly homeless veterans who had already been offered jobs at what was now being called Silvercrest Sanctuary. We don't see this as an ending, Clara told the reporter, her voice steady despite her nerves. It's a beginning. The donations, the attention, they're allowing us to create something meaningful here. A place where broken things can be mended, where second chances are possible. Miles nodded in agreement. My wife always saw potential where others saw only problems. She would have loved what's happening here. His voice caught slightly. A month ago, I was considering selling this ranch. Now, it has a new purpose. That purpose had taken shape with remarkable speed. Silvercrest would become a dual sanctuary, offering rehabilitation for neglected horses and temporary housing for homeless individuals interested in working with the animals as part of their own recovery. The program would provide job training, support services, and eventually, placement assistance. Clara would oversee the equine medical care while completing her veterinary degree, returning to the ranch upon graduation to serve as its permanent veterinarian. The story had already inspired similar programs across the country, with Silvercrest serving as a model. As the interview concluded, Clara was struck by the beautiful irony of it all. Her desperate search for shelter on that snowy night had led not just to a temporary refuge, but to a home, for herself, for others who would follow in her footsteps, and for animals who needed a second chance. Later that evening, as the excitement died down and the visitors departed, Clara returned to the barn for Solace's evening check. The Arabian greeted her with a soft nicker, pressing his muzzle against her shoulder in what had become their nightly ritual. Miles joined her, carrying 2 mugs of steaming apple cider. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Silas contentedly munching his evening hay. "You know," Clara said finally, "that night in the barn, I told Silas I missed having a purpose. Something that mattered beyond just surviving." Miles smiled, the grief lines in his face now balanced by newer creases, laugh lines forming at the corners of his eyes. "And now?" Clara looked around at the transformed barn, at Silas's healthy form, at the plans for the sanctuary pinned to the bulletin board. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed her desperate trek through the snow just 1 month earlier. "No," she said softly. "I think we've all found exactly where we belong."